Well, good afternoon and welcome back again for our final panel for the afternoon before we have a keynote and we free you for a wonderful social reception to continue the discussions today. But we'd like to get started with this panel. My name is David Lindeman. I direct our health programs here at Citrus, and I'm delighted to be joined by three experts in this field where we are going to focus on some very practical aspects of AI applications in specific populations, looking at it from, in this case, the older workforce, as well as older adults themselves and what the impact for elders. Also, persons with disabilities, looking across the entire spectrum of ways AI can be beneficial, and in both cases, some of the challenges here. But we have experts from both the world of NGOs, of industry, and from large corporations, and that's who will frame this. So I'm delighted to be joined by my three colleagues. First, Anita Aaron, who is the Executive Director for the World Institute of Disabilities. And again, you have bios for all of us, but I'll just highlight a few points for each person. Anita not only comes as an expert in this space and having worked as Executive Director for the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco prior to that, but in the space of policy in this area, looking at a number of the impacts and ways we need to focus technology solutions for those individuals who are dealing with disabilities across the whole spectrum, physical, cognitive, et cetera. We're also joined by Scott Collins, who is, again, I always get the right one. Are you president, Scott?
Both. I couldn't find somebody else.
CEO of not only Linkages Solutions, but Linkages Ventures, who has been engaged in the space of senior services, responsible as a group purchasing organization for over 800 senior living organizations in the United States, but also investing in startup companies who are engaged in working in this area. And Scott has tremendous depth and knowledge of looking at many different types of technology solutions, but particularly those that will be available to help us as we deal with the challenging issues around the workforce for older adults. And then Megan Lawrence, who I think still has the best title of the day. I have to steal your thunder because Megan is Accessibility Technical Evangelist for Microsoft. And as such, she has been a champion, and we've been very thrilled to be able to work with her here at Citrus. And her experience and her teams throughout Microsoft, looking at different ways to advance new areas, and actually very creative programs that I know she'll want to announce a program today, but particularly as she's working with their Accessibility User Research Collective. So again, three wonderful experts who I'm going to ask to each give a presentation, like you heard from our previous panels, on some of the issues that they see most relevant in the area that they can speak to. We're going to then carry on a discussion with several of the points that we would like to raise. Some of the challenges, again, we're looking for opportunity areas. We're looking for the ways we can apply artificial intelligence, not just the problem issues, but ways that we think this is going to lead to very rapid advances and where we can put our energies collectively. And then we would like to, as you've heard before, open it up. So if you can be thinking ahead of time, we will take questions from the audience. We'll again go around with cards and open it up to a discussion with you. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Anita to frame some of the issues that she's seen from the World Institute of Disability and from her perspective on this space. Anita?
So at WID, World Institute on Disability, we sort of live at the intersection between people with disabilities and identified areas of needs or rights, and the other side being, is there something now that can and should be done to impact those needs and rights? So this is a perfect topic for WID to be looking into regarding machine learning and AI, because one of the major implications that WID is always looking at is is there a policy solution? Is there a practice solution? So if you look at it from a policy perspective, this opens the door. This is like hopefully, like a way to jump in and deal with some policies that have hung around longer than they need to because nobody was going to change them for fear they would impact people with disabilities negatively in some way. And so, for example, what comes up for me is our government disability benefits system, which actually you have to prove that you are unable to work to qualify to be on those benefits. So then the initiative for somebody to get off the benefits is really difficult, because if they prove they can work, they lose their benefit. Anyway, it's this circular kind of thinking. If we have other types of work that we can create, if there's other ways people with disabilities can contribute, and if AI is one of the ways that happens, then we begin to pull that government program towards changing that definition so that the inability to work is not the base criteria. So WID is always looking for those openings of how a change in this or that can influence this policy over there. So AI is a very exciting process for us. And I will say that one of the big things we look at is employment and what is holding people with disabilities back from employment. And in almost every case, when you look at what the identified issues are, we believe there could be a machine learning solution, at least partial to that. So one of those things that we run into a lot that's identified is hiring supervisor bias. So you have people who say, I don't have any biases about hiring, I want the most qualified person, and then they repeatedly hire the same demographic over and over again. And I would actually contend that they may not have any kind of conscious bias. But anyway, if you really can use the kind of screening that brings to that manager people based on their experience, their merit, whatever, regardless of ethnicity, disability, age, I think you begin to change that system ever so slowly. So there's just two examples of why WID is interested in the policy of what's going on, because we think it creates more room for people to be successful. The other thing that we're excited about is how AI can be used to better identify and make more individually relevant some of the tools that WID offers. We have tools that help you understand your government benefits and how those interact with employment, for example. But it's a cumbersome process. You enter a lot of data. The computer that runs behind the thing has to be continually updated so that that data matches with what the actual benefits are in a particular state. If that were much more identified based on a machine learning principle, this information would come more quickly. It would be more personalized and less of an estimate and more of an exact number. So it's those kinds of issues around people with disabilities that make us feel very positive about the direction that things are going in. And I'll just add one final thing. I just relocated from living in Oakland near a BART station where I'd run my life for many years because I could get anywhere I needed to go as a visually impaired person by BART or whatever. Just moved to a neighborhood called Point Richmond. And were there not rideshare services, if there wasn't the technology that identified those, I could never have lived there. And I never in my life understood the individual differences something like these processes could make.
Well said. And a number of points that come off of that that we should refer back to from Uda's presentation about how we do everything even from the outset in terms of new definitions for how we look at the type of definitions around a position description to the evaluation, et cetera. Be a number of things we can come back to. Scott, could you take us in the direction for, as you've worked in senior living, what we see are some of the opportunity areas?
Thank you, David. So what I thought I would do is just take a few minutes to sort of provide some context for some of the challenges that we're facing inside of healthcare and particularly aging services, and then identify just a couple of different solutions that we've seen that leverage both artificial intelligence and machine learning, but then there's also some other technologies that underlie that as well. I'm really excited to be here because instead of looking at some of the significant potential challenges associated with utilizing AI, I see tremendous opportunity in an industry that is facing really some unprecedented factors. So we've got a massively aging population globally. Certainly here we're challenged in the US. We've got a workforce that's shrinking, both a professional workforce. We're having a harder time finding professionals to come in and do the work that needs to be done from a healthcare perspective, but then also from an informal caregiver standpoint. Fewer and fewer people are available to provide that family or unpaid care. So against that backdrop, along with declining reimbursement at the state and federal level, increasing costs associated with providing care, it creates quite an interesting environment for healthcare providers and also older adults. And so with that as a bit of context, what we've seen are a suite of technologies being developed that are really enabling. So we're not thinking in terms of replacing workers. A lot of what our industry is looking at is how can we utilize or leverage these different technologies to help us be more effective, more empathetic, to make better decisions. And then also, finally, what I would say is that as we look to invest in companies, a lot of times we see very well-intentioned entrepreneurs developing products, services, and technologies for an aging population that aren't really relevant to that consumer segment, partly because the user has not been involved in the design aspect or the front end of innovation. So part of what we're trying to do is bring that ecosystem together to say, all right, if there's a solution to be developed, much like in other segments of the population, as we break down the demographics, how do we start to get older adults involved in the front end of that design? So with that being said, a couple of highlights a couple of technologies I'd like to highlight, really from a workforce engagement perspective. A company called Cloverleaf.me. It's a startup actually in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it builds on one of the topics that we talked about in the previous panel around workforce diversity. So what they've done is utilized artificial intelligence to help build more effective teams. They started out in the employee engagement space, but decided to pivot towards effectiveness. So what they do is they use a proprietary combination of 3 different personality profiles, and they build an inventory of all your human capital. And then when you have a project that needs to be achieved or fulfilled, they'll look at how do they take the factors of that project and build out a very diverse set of team members. And so you can use sliders to really change the different dynamics of the project itself, and then identify which teams are best suited working in combination to achieve those objectives. They're in market right now, and what they've been able to see is that utilizing their product to build these teams, as opposed to just randomly assigning individuals to specific tasks, they've been able to see a 26% improvement in outcomes as measured by shortened timeline to get the project done, coming in under budget, and meeting the project criteria that was laid out at the beginning. Another company that we've seen from here in the Bay Area called Embodied Labs. So we talked about effectiveness, but then empathy. How do you, as a 25-year-old worker, understand an 83-year-old with Alzheimer's? How do you understand what they're going through, and how do you be empathetic to the challenges that they face in their everyday life? Or how do you have end-of-life conversations with people in a hospice environment, palliative care situation, where you can enable them to have a better experience? So what Embodied Labs has created is a virtual reality tool that actually walks the users into those worlds in a way that is unbelievable. In fact, one of our members here is using that in their hospice environment to be able to have those really, really difficult end-of-life conversations. Or how do you mimic the thought process or mental cognition of someone with those type of challenges associated with dementia and Alzheimer's? So effectiveness, empathy. Then when we talk about decision making, there's a company called Sequentia that is using massive downloads of claims data to help build a better clinical pathway from the time an older adult presents at the ER all the way up through their time in the hospital and then to post-discharge. So how do we provide a more seamless transition in care? How do we provide for better outcomes at lower costs? And then a company we recently invested in called Socially Determined. A lot of times older adults are looked at through the lens of their physical challenges or cognitive impairments. But there's a lot of other things that can't be solved with pills and creams and things like that. And so what this company has done is used artificial intelligence and machine learning to assess the social determinants of health that an older adult would find them in, and then use that data to create an overlay on their plan of care so that they can begin to incorporate things that's going to reduce social isolation, ensure that they have transportation and access to make sure that they're eating healthy diets, and that they're engaged with loved ones, and that they have a social environment around them that's going to help improve their quality of life and also outcomes from a health perspective. Some areas that we would love to see work being done in, building more on social isolation and transportation. My mom is 87 years old. She works at Florida Atlantic University. Recently she fell, and it was a fairly significant fall. She contacted her boss at the university and said, I was thinking at my age, I'm probably going to hang it up anyway. And he said, absolutely not. We need you here, not just because of what you do for a living for us, and she's been there for 35 years, but we need you here, and you need to be here. So whatever we need to do to make sure that you have access to this work environment, and my mom lives in Boca Raton, Florida, shouldn't have any other family down there, so work is family. So how can we utilize this type of technology to make sure that folks like my mom can remain connected socially and provide for a higher and better quality of life?
Excellent example, Scott. Thank you so much. Let's turn to Megan then, in terms of Microsoft being a leader in this space, but we're also seeing we have wonderful representatives from many other companies here today, Google, et cetera, and a number of startups that we'll want to refer back to who are using different applications of AI. But you've been fantastic at embodying how we use this to change how we look at the workforce overall and engage individuals over time. Could you share your perspective on this from the broader industry perspective, since this is critical for not only across some of the demographics we've been just talking about, but in general, and how industry can do things at scale. So
right.
Please.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for hosting this entire day. I have a notepad in front of me that has like 3 to 5 pages per talk with notes written on it, because these are the kinds of venues that really, I think, help spur the kind of ideas and innovation that, frankly, industry is dependent on. So one of the biggest takeaways for me today is that AI is a tool. It's a tool like any other tool that we have in our tool belt, and that's exciting. But there's a little bit more care that needs to be taken the way that we develop these tools. And so part of what I see as opportunity is the way in which we look at maybe traditional barriers within the disability community and think about how AI may help solve them. Now, something seemingly simple is that we recognize one of the largest accessibility errors today is the lack of alternative text or image descriptions. Well, AI is pretty darn good at that. It's good on Facebook, it's good at Microsoft, it's good on lots of different platforms. Maybe you take that one step further with some tools like Seeing AI, which is an application that Microsoft has put out for the blind and low vision community to be able to read handwriting, to be able to read menus, and evaluate sentiment in human faces and the like. And I think what's interesting about all of those examples is that they came from really great people with disabilities in our companies. So Seeing AI was developed by a blind engineer. And that in and of itself is probably, our most treasured commodity is people with disabilities in our organizations. And so in order to push these boundaries moving forward, Microsoft recently announced the AI for Accessibility program, which is a $25 million grant program where we're really looking for that magic, that the disability community coming together with the great technological startup engineering community. Oftentimes it's the same individuals, sometimes it's a matchmaking event to really increase the types of applications that we're seeing into that program. So I encourage everybody, if you've got a great idea, to have a look at that, because as I'm going to channel my boss, Jenny Leigh Fleury, game on. Like, we want to see, your cool ideas. Okay, but what do we know about AI? What do we know about this thing that now has many different names after today? Intelligent amplification, inclusive intelligence, artificial intelligence. All of that means data. When I give talks, the one thing I say to my audience is, what is AI? And by the end, they all go, data. And I'm like, good job, right? And so whether we're looking, in my opinion, at the way in which we use data, like Jutta, I think, brilliantly outlined for all of us, is that perhaps there's algorithmic weighting, making sure that those edge cases have the appropriate emphasis in a data set to make sure that that application is inclusive. Or whether it's this more fundamental concept of a disability data identity. How do we, as people in the disability community, own, use, share, and protect our data? And I think that goes down, comes down to those ethics, this ethics conversation, which the one thing we haven't heard a lot of today is government policy and regulation. So Microsoft came out calling on the government to put regulation in place for facial recognition, because we know that AI can be used to do great things, but AI also has the possibility to do things that all of us would feel uncomfortable about. So that's something else that I push us to think of, is what would AI policy look like, and what would inclusive AI policy mean, and how do we use our data to help make sure the right thing happens. Just to close things out, on the last panel I heard, what do we know about AI and the future of work for people with disabilities, or frankly, any of us? That it will create, destroy, and transform jobs. We know that, right? It is going to do all three of those things. What do we not know? We don't know how, when, or where. And I thought that was just such an interesting juxtaposition between what we think we know and what we think is going to happen in the future. So I want to draw a little bit of a parallel between the way that many technology companies have incentivized their own workforce and become very successful, which is to build distracting, addictive technology. And we know that technology is now driving the largest disability in the world, which is mental health disabilities, right? And a lot of that is using AI. And so are we as a community ready to say that we not only want to change what we think of as value in our technology-human relationship, but now as we bring this into the HR world, are we willing to say that we have, in some senses, created a job system that is not celebrating diversity and equality and inclusion in the ways we think that it does? That's a big question, and I don't have all the answers. You're shocked, I can tell. None of you have all the answers either. But that's why it's so incredibly important for all of us to be gathered here today. Now I sound like we're getting married. But to really honestly push this, because it's not industry, it's not academia, it's not NGOs, it's not the disability community alone. It is the collection of all of us that will help answer some of these very real and very hard questions, and create, the next generation of technology that does the things that we never thought it could do, and that puts a smile on our face.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you. And that really leads to, you've shared a number of points, and thank all three of you for getting us started in this area, because as we've heard from all the wonderful comments throughout the day, it brings us to a few interesting issues that we'd like to come back and round out before we go into our keynote. But let me start with one, because not only the wonderful point that you had, Megan, about how we define AI, and we have so many different definitions. Kathy Kim, our colleague from Davis, was just already saying, how do we define AI in each of these areas? And I think it's an underlying challenge that we have to always go back and say, what are we discussing here? Artificial intelligence has many different definitions, can be looked at, many different aspects, but it does come back to data. But we heard many different examples throughout the day. So I think it's very important, whether it be towards robotics, as Ken was leading us. We heard others that were more remote technology. There were actually more digital issues in healthcare. Again, in each area, one has to be very careful about how they're defining this area of artificial intelligence and data science and how they use it. One key issue, and you just brought up a great point, Megan, is what about a strong policy? How do we set policy? I thought it was very interesting. Ironically, Axios this morning put a major point out that the U.S. does not have an AI policy. Now, we're dealing with China, who has already had a policy and is growing it rapidly. But not only do we not have an AI policy, but we don't have specific issues related to some of the points here. So how do we deal with inclusivity in that policy? How do we raise some of these points? So I'd love to throw back to the three of you. Are there ways that we should help inform or help guide that policy? And what are some of the things we need in it to address the needs of the specific populations and opportunity areas that we're talking about here?
I think, I would just say that from the inclusiveness in terms of accessibility, I think there have to be people with disabilities knowledgeable in the systems all along the way. We've seen too many times where if developers create something without that input, the outcome is not accessible for the most part. Then they have to go back and try to retrofit, recreate, do all this. And sometimes that takes years. Legitimately so. They've set their technology development in a path, and to circumvent that path is really very difficult. So I think the first one on inclusion for me is inclusion from the beginning through the process.
I couldn't agree more, and I would say from our segment of the healthcare continuum, that would hold true with older adults. So much of the public policy conversation in our part of the healthcare continuum is around reimbursement and regulation. But I think more needs to be done to change the conversation around optimization and enablement. You know, as we look at this massively growing demographic and the fact that there just isn't enough care that's out there to be delivered, if this promise holds true, to be able to make the existing workers more efficient, to help us build more effective teams, to maybe do a better job of recruiting and improve quality of life, those stories have to be told, but they have to be told by the end user. This isn't just about changing reimbursement policy and things like that, which dominates most of the conversation.
So to me, one of the things that I find wonderful and frustrating about policy is that that was kind of a loaded, yeah.
You can just stop right there.
Enter that conversation. No, is that you know, let's look at the WCAG 2.1 that has been refreshed recently, right? There was a lot of conversation specifically from the cognitive disability community about having more policy and standards around you know, what it means to be a cognitive, you know, person with a cognitive disability using technology. And the bottom line is many of the things that may have been good or that community wanted in there didn't make it, because policy has to be a yes or no question. Did you meet it? Did you not meet it? Right? It's WCAG. Did you meet WCAG? Did you not meet WCAG? And so we've set ourselves up in a binary environment where it's like you have either done good or you have done bad. And yet we spent the whole day talking about this nuanced environment called artificial intelligence and ethics and all of these questions that we don't have our heads around yet. So, you know, that's one thing that I guess kind of makes me pause a little bit, is how do we enter into this new era of technology without a binary yes or no, you know, policy environment? And then a second thing I've just been playing around with, and I haven't really said it out loud very many times, so this will be interesting. Is that, you know, how is it that we're going to test AI in the future? Probably with another AI, right? It's going to be AI testing AI. And that's actually in all reality. So again, we come back to that idea of tagging disability data. So at some point, I have to have a really rich disability data set to go in and evaluate whether your AI is biased to people with disabilities. So again, coming all the way back to data, how and when do you share your data? And how do you go about saying, I want it to be tagged because I want it to be inclusive. I want it to be private because I don't want to be singled out.
I think gets us into a whole deep area on who controls the data and access to it and privacy security of that, which will, we could probably have a whole nother workshop or session summit or just around those areas alone. I would like to push each of you a bit to think also about the positive opportunities we have here, the low-hanging fruit for opening this up. Scott, you were framing a number of excellent companies. They're actually dealing with impairments for older adults, addressing healthcare, social issues, et cetera, in terms of how we are helping individuals function in society. But on the other hand, in both cases, we have, not only we've heard throughout the day, a huge need for expanding our workforce. We have huge opportunities for different populations at any age to stay engaged and become even more engaged. And how do we use these technologies? And even as we get older adults, who the vast majority are not going to be dealing with the issues, some that you've just raised in terms of health limitations and impairment, but are actually looking for productive, engaged life. We're changing, we're really disrupting retirement. We're disrupting aging. We're disrupting disability here. So what are some of those low-hanging fruit in terms of positive ways to, that we can very quickly move on to help advance the different populations we're talking about?
That's a great question. So I think one is, how could we use this technology to keep older experienced workers in the workforce longer? Maybe not to carry out the routine tasks, but to elevate from a position where they can share wisdom, lessons learned along the way, and what role does artificial intelligence, machine learning, technology, call it what you will, how can that be used to magnify or multiply that effect within a diverse workforce, I think is going to be important for us. And then there's some of the more practical things, whether it's an older worker or not even an older worker, utilizing those exoskeleton technology to allow people to stay in the workforce longer or to prevent injury. As we look at the caregiving labor force, it's a pretty thankless task. They're not well paid. There's a pretty significant misalignment of expectations. So can we utilize this type of technology to do a better job of matching people with jobs in this part of healthcare so that there's not that misalignment of expectations? Because what we find is that where we are losing candidates coming into this workforce, it's the time between when you're hired and you actually start, or within the first couple of weeks of employment, where they start to get a real sense for, wow, this is not the job I signed up for. So is there a way to use this to better align the expectations of that workforce so that we can bring in the ones who really want to be in this segment of healthcare and do a better job of retaining them?
I'm furiously writing notes on my trusty notepad here. So I think one of the most important things we can do is have a very robust definition of what we mean by inclusive AI. I think we throw that term around a lot, but when I go and talk to very smart, very wonderful people within Microsoft and I say disability and they go, what? And they think race, they think ethnicity, they think gender, they think socioeconomic data. And so I think we have to be very specific and bold to mean, diversity and inclusion, no, diversity, disability, and inclusion. So again, pushing to make sure that disability is very well positioned and part of that definition of what we mean by inclusive AI. I think two other pieces that I think are fairly low-hanging fruit. One of them, and Yuta, you're never going to forgive me because I really hope that you're going to be putting in a data proposal to AI for accessibility, because I think we have to show. So we talked a lot about disability data makes more robust. Right, if we include the data, it's going to make a more robust AI system, but I think we have to show that. I think we have to have a very good example of why including that outlier data actually just makes better AI systems overall. So then we take, we set the definition with disability in it, and then we say, but this isn't about disability, this is actually just about good programming. And then we take it back to the inclusive design conversation.
Another element that we were talking about earlier, pre-meeting, is actually on how we engage individuals in this. And I thought Dan's program, the presentations this afternoon, and then the program he'll be working on tomorrow, really get at that in terms of inclusive design being fundamental on this. We can't say it enough and over again, the importance of engaging individuals who will use these technologies, use these applications, whether it's, again, an older adult themselves who will be using it or the workforce that we're envisioning to help in the future. So we're starting to get some questions. And so in our last 15 minutes, why don't we open it up, please, if you have some issues, ideas, and these can be broader than just to the issues to our panelists right here, things that have been emerging throughout the day. We'd love to have you focus on it. One of the things that we have a few questions here for Scott related to some patient care issues, and these go beyond just working with older adults, but they're actually in terms of our entire health space. So let me just start with a few of those, and we have a few broader questions which I think will be very interesting for the whole panel to respond to. So Scott, the question is, could you be specific in how Linkages is using AI in senior living facilities in terms of specific examples currently of patient care? Are there a few that you've seen in your communities, with some of the companies you have, that are very obvious examples that really have scalable impact?
Yeah, I would say, and I mentioned it earlier, Socially Determined is a company that a number of our members are using now to really improve that plan of care, to be more holistic in how they look at developing a care plan. So not just from a clinical standpoint, but really maximizing the benefit that they can deliver through using social determinants of health in a way that is data-driven, as opposed to in the past, there wasn't really a great way to capture that information about an individual and use that as a way to improve the plan of care. Socially Determined is being used in acute care. Sequentia, another company I'd mentioned earlier, is seeing some really significant improvement in outcomes, not just when an individual is in a hospital environment, but from a post-discharge standpoint, being able to look more broadly across the health ecosystem to say, all right, if this individual presented with this particular issue and we're now discharging them, where should we be sending them based on the data so that we know they're going to have the best clinical outcome from a post-discharge standpoint, as opposed to, oh, you can just go anywhere and whatever happens, happens. So we're seeing some significant improvement in those type of outcomes for older adults and other parts of the healthcare ecosystem.
Great examples, thank you.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Here's one that really applies. While it's addressed to Scott, I think it actually looks to the issue that we have to address very carefully, and that is individuals who may not want to take advantage of big data or are fearful of it, or et cetera. I think giving a quick example that Scott and I and colleagues here, Susan Poor, working with San Francisco Tech Council, which is actually engaged at how do we make sure that in a very tech-savvy area, a robust city that can address these issues, we still have literally thousands of individuals who do not have access to this technology, not even access to the internet. So we have to look at this disparity issue. And the one question here, there's another side to it, and that's people who are still not comfortable with these technologies. So the broader question here is, how do you combat challenges the population not wanting to use big data, using AI, are fearful of this area? How would the three of you respond to that?
You know, it is a little off-putting when you go online and look for something and then move from program to program and it tries to sell you that same thing again in another way over here. I think there is a discomfort to how much the information we put out there is out there and can be used by a lot of different sources. And so I think for me, I have to stop and think, well, what damage would this do, really? What's this going to cause? And I think it's different whether it's medical information and whether it's the fact that I like sun hats. And that, you know, no matter where I go, they try to sell me a sun hat. So I do think a part of it is giving people some ways to think about where they see information popping up. I think another thing, that sometimes the whole digital divide has got as much to do, it's affordability, but it's also usability. And if you're somebody with a disability that has access, that access is difficult, why would you participate? I think it's less likely that somebody's going to have internet at home or a smartphone or whatever, because they just don't know how to use it. So I do think it's a more complex problem than data.
2011, we did one of the first studies in the country looking at technology use among older adults. And every other study you've seen, they break it down in 5 or 10 year increments, and then you get to age 65, they throw a plus sign on it, and magically that defines everybody else. So we actually started a research company that was based on the idea of we want to understand that plus. So we broke it down in 5 year increments to up to over 100, and what we found were the challenges broke down 3 ways in terms of the digital divide. It was awareness. So there's so much out there that older adults who aren't familiar with utilizing technology, they don't even know what's there. Affordability, you talked about people that don't even have internet connectivity or access to technology that could be used. And so it was awareness, access, and affordability. We refielded that study a few years later and found that the digital divide is shrinking. And then Pew came out with a study in 2014 that we reached out to them and asked if we could do that, but again, take our slant on it and really go and break down that over 65 population again. And so I think from what gives us some promise is that we are seeing greater technology adoption among people over the age of 65, but we still have to do a lot more in terms of awareness and affordability, because sometimes the fear is built on, I've never had access to this before, it's unknown. And sometimes the reasons for you not having access to it comes down to affordability and a basic understanding of what those tools can do to enhance your life as opposed to create challenges for you.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you on sort of the area of transparency. Oftentimes I'll ask people, what is AI? You just get this sort of blank stare back at you, and it's like a Steven Spielberg movie. And you're like, well, yes, technically. And so I think that within the disability community and frankly just society at large, we don't really know what AI is. And even if I did say, yes, you can use my data, I don't really know how technology companies use my data. And I think that has become painfully aware to all of us after the Facebook, stories that have come out that, oh my God, like that's how my data was being used? I thought I was just posting my pictures of my kids on, holiday.
Right.
So I do think that there needs to be a greater level of education and transparency about what these things really are. And I would love to see, more companies taking on GDPR. Because while it might not be the end-all be-all, at least it is a way in which we have communicated with our government and our tech companies and ourselves that we do own our data as individuals and we do have the right to say when and how we share it. So I think it kind of sits between those pieces.
And could you elaborate on GDPR in terms of the European, where it started, and now how it's impacting on us in North America?
So I'm not a policy wonk, as one of my dear friends at Microsoft would say. So I don't want to suggest that that I've been working on GDPR, but in general, right, it's the general data privacy requirements that have come out of the European Union that say essentially there is a level of transparency about how data is being shared and that you have the ability to turn it off, right? You essentially get to say, I want to use your tool, but I don't want to have to share my data in order to do it. And that is just such a 101, that's probably sub 101. So I encourage you to go and look for more specificity on your own. But I think here in North America, we do have a lot of globalization. And so a company like Microsoft is a global company. And we have taken GDPR on entirely throughout the company, whether you're a customer based in the United States, whether you're a customer that's in the US and global or simply global. So I know many other companies are now being faced with, do I just enact GDPR for my customers that live in the countries that this rule applies to, or is this something that I'm going to holistically take on because it's a stance that we think is important? And that's very much up for debate. And again, I am not the end-all be-all on that topic.
But this really relates to a very critical issue, and again, as we get into privacy of data, that the data underlie everything we're talking about in terms of AI today. But what you've all just been speaking to really, it was very interesting. One of our audience members took this to an even higher level, and that is, how can AI help in overcoming the digital divide between the global north and global south? So we have digital divide on many levels here, and as we look at it, and I think one of the opportunities, and here in Citrus, we're working again on our social good initiatives, on looking at ways that we can use these, not just from an industry perspective or working in commercialization, but how do we look for populations, countries, et cetera, where we can take the benefits of this area. So could either any of you address, or in this whole digital divide area, whatever cut you want, how we see AI being able to help reduce the problems right now? There's some obvious simple ones, but do you have any areas where you think we should put some energy into in terms of reducing the digital divide through AI?
I'll take that to, so funny, I'm lost for words. Okay, as the evangelist, that doesn't happen very often. That we talked about the idea of usability, right? That idea that, one, you need to have people with disabilities engaged in the design, development, and testing of a product or a system, and that if the accessibility is okay but the usability is really bad, you're still, exacerbating that digital divide. And we have at Microsoft, it's called 1 Week, and it's a big hack where everyone just sort of gets to forget their day jobs and go join a hackathon team. And one of, I think, the most interesting hacks that we saw come out this year was, how do you basically use AI to make any website accessible no matter how bad that backend looks, right? So again, how can we begin to proactively apply artificial intelligence for personalization and creating more accessible, usable products and services from a different angle instead of the back end?
Very interesting.
The one thing, and I'm not sure what the role of AI in this is, but as we look at other cultures, being able to take into account the specific nuances embodied in those cultures, how that relates to the utilization of technology. So when we look at more of a Western mindset, I think we probably look at technology from one perspective. I know my wife is from the Middle East. They have a totally different perspective on things than we do, but she was raised in Jamaica in the West Indies. So again, another completely different frame of reference in terms of how they interact with the same things we do, but up to and including, they speak English just like we do, yet they have a whole different set of things and terms that mean entirely different concepts than we do here. So I don't know if there's a way for artificial intelligence to begin gathering that knowledge and that insight and understanding around diverse cultures and beginning to tailor technology solutions that are going to be relevant and resonate within those parts of the globe.
Very intriguing. Let me, we had a few more questions for each of our panelists. Unfortunately, as we're running out of time, I'd like to suggest that we'll have time over our networking period, our reception later, to carry that out. I had asked each of them to help me close with preparing at least one idea that they'd like to have you go away from this meeting with, takeaway. We benefit from having sat through the whole day and heard some wonderful presentations. So I'd like to put it to each of them, if there's one thing that they could take away from the use of AI in this space, where we have opportunities, what would that be? So Anita, I'll let you start with one takeaway for the audience.
My takeaway is about looking at social policy as it relates to AI and not letting the opportunity slip by.
Well said.
Yeah, really well said. Data is data.
Brilliant. So brilliant.
I'm done. No.
That's it.
But sometimes this feels like it gets reduced to a very impersonal conversation. And if I could just encourage people from and this is even impersonal, user-centered design. What I would love to see for our part of the healthcare space, go deep in your conversations with older adults. Really take time to understand the humanity and the uniqueness and use that to create truly game-changing solutions, not only for older adults, but for the people who are providing care and support for them.
You know, it's funny because I think my takeaway very much echoes what, you know, those last two sentiments were, which is that this is a conversation and the conversation is now. So get engaged, have an opinion, talk to people. Don't sit back and think, oh, they'll figure it out.
Well, with that note, I think that you've really, the three of you, I can't thank you enough. With you as an audience, would you please join me in thanking these three people for their great points?